Good evening. We begin a deep exploration into the life and influence of General Heinz Guderian, a man whose theories and forceful advocacy revolutionized military strategy and tactics. Guderian is rightly recognized as the dean of armored warfare and one of the most important founders of mechanized warfare. In the modern era, nearly every military force globally possesses an independent branch or a specialized corps dedicated to armored operations, whether for unified combined arms campaigns or singular offensive and defensive battles. This omnipresent reality is a direct result of Guderian's legacy. Guderian's early career provided the necessary foundation for his later radical thinking. He experienced the stalemate of the First World War as a staff officer, source, external, type, which provided critical context regarding the failures of traditional military thinking. The catalyst for this military revolution occurred on September 15th, 1916. On this date, the global military establishment awoke to a new reality. The tank, developed in secrecy by the British, this new weapon was unleashed against German forces during the Battle of the Somme on the French war front. Initially, these tanks were slow-moving iron fortresses. Because the tank was a completely new invention, its function in battle was not immediately understood. Many traditional generals viewed the tank as a failure, believing its use would pass quickly, convinced that the cavalry, which had been the backbone of mobile warfare since the dawn of history, could never be replaced by the tank. They failed to anticipate that these iron fortresses would fundamentally change the nature of war. The perils of this conservative perspective were demonstrated globally. For instance, the Soviet General Semyon Budyonny was one of the reactionary generals who were not convinced of the tank's effectiveness. He was among the senior commanders in the Soviet Union at the start of World War II. The stunning effectiveness of German mechanized warfare inflicted a devastating defeat on the Soviet forces, resulting in an enormous historical loss: 1.5 million Soviet prisoners of war. This catastrophe serves as a prime example that the transition to mechanized warfare was not sudden, requiring thinkers with imagination and foresight. Following Germany's defeat in World War I and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, severe limitations were imposed on the German military, including the reduction of the officer corps to just 4,000 officers. Heinz Guderian, then a lieutenant, was one of the retained officers. During this turbulent post-war period, Russia was embroiled in its own civil war, leaving Germany's eastern borders vulnerable to attacks by armed Russian and Polish groups. To counter these threats, anti-communist paramilitary forces known as the Freikorps or Iron Corps defended the eastern frontiers. In June 1919, Guderian joined the Freikorps, serving as a second staff officer. The 1920s proved formative for Guderian's armored warfare concepts. He encountered the work of Ernst Volkheim. Although Volkheim is not well known outside specialized military circles, he provided the first academic influence on armored warfare that shaped Guderian's later career. In 1924, Volkheim published a series of articles that constitute the first theoretical foundation for the armored branch. These works proposed the use of armored formations and, critically, included the concept that would bring Guderian international fame: the establishment of an independent tank corps. Guderian was highly conversant in the military ideas being developed abroad. He closely studied the writings and experiments of Soviet and British military theorists. Among these influential figures was the British General J.F.C. Fuller, whose works Guderian read extensively. Guderian combined this theoretical and academic knowledge, gleaned from constantly studying military history and writing his own articles in military journals, to qualify as an instructor and military lecturer. He was known for being a good, charismatic presenter, though sometimes prone to sharp sarcasm towards his students. By 1927, Guderian was promoted to the rank of major. He was then assigned to the transport section within an institution known as the TMI, This was a camouflaged version of the General Staff Command, which Germany was prohibited from possessing under the Treaty of Versailles. By the autumn of 1928, Guderian had become a leading voice on tank warfare tactics. Ironically, despite his expertise, Guderian had never actually been inside a tank. His first actual tank ride took place in the summer of 1929. The tank was a Swedish model, the Stridsvagn M2129. He continued instructing at the Office for Motorized Transport Training until his promotion in 1931. In 1931, Guderian was appointed Chief of Staff for the deployment of mechanized forces under the command of General Oswald Lutz. Lutz was responsible for the initial mechanization efforts of the German army, placing Guderian at the core of the army's transformation into a mechanized force. This development notably occurred before Adolf Hitler's ascent to power. Guderian played a fundamental role in developing the concepts for the armored divisions, known as the Panzer divisions, and the system of offensive mechanized warfare later termed Blitzkrieg, lightning war. A crucial point, often obscured by Guderian's memoirs, is that the Panzer Division concept was not his individual creation. It was a partnership with his commander, General Lutz, who was equally enthusiastic about the idea. Guderian became the prominent public figure, the media face, advocating for the armored division, while Lutz preferred to work discreetly behind the scenes. The sources confirm that other key figures contributed to the theoretical development of the Panzer divisions, including Erwin Rommel, who later commanded the Afrika Korps, and Georg Hans Reinhardt, commander of the Third Army Corps. While the overall theoretical structure was a collaborative effort, Guderian was undoubtedly the most famous spokesperson for the concept. Guderian's most critical independent contribution to armored warfare was the development of the communication system between panzer units. This single innovation is arguably the most significant practical development in armored warfare since the tank's inception. It is essential to acknowledge the conceptual framework developed by Lutz. Core operational characteristics of the Panzer Division, such as defining them as separate formations, emphasizing massing of forces, and relying on shock and surprise attack, originated with Lutz, who was the first to document these ideas. However, Guderian was the most important and prominent practical specialist in armored warfare. Mechanized mobile warfare posed two enormous practical challenges. One, logistics. If a mechanized army, tanks, armored vehicles, moved vast distances across the battlefield, how could essential supplies, fuel, spare parts be guaranteed? Two, coordination. How could large-scale mechanized forces be effectively moved and commanded? Mobile warfare remained merely an attractive theoretical concept until the systems addressing these logistical and operational constraints were established. Guderian provided the answers, creating the necessary systems for supplying forces, managing vehicle sustainment, and organizing movement routes. These logistics plans were eventually codified in the 4 orders on the movement of the Sixth Army, source external. In 1938, following Hitler's purge of officers deemed non-sympathetic to the regime, General Lutz was retired. Guderian was then appointed to lead the first practical test of a Panzer division during the annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss. The result of this mobilization was a sobering disaster. The deployment was chaotic, tanks broke down due to poor maintenance, fuel supplies were quickly exhausted, and the supply system failed. The source indicates that if the operation had involved actual fighting, Guderian's forces would certainly have been defeated. Guderian, however, meticulously reviewed the errors and systematically fixed the structural flaws within the Panzer Division organization. This period also solidified Guderian's personal relationship with Hitler. When the Western powers acquiesced to Germany's occupation of the Sudetenland, the German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, Guderian executed the operation at the head of the 16th Sun Mechanized Corps. In August 1939, Guderian took command of the newly formed 19th Corps. He was tasked with spearheading the northern attack during the invasion of Poland, which commenced on September 1, 1939. Under his command was one of the 6 Panzer divisions in the German army at the time, representing approximately 15% of Germany's total armored force used in the invasion. Guderian's mission was to advance from East Prussia southward toward Warsaw. He executed this mission with the aggressive speed characteristic of German military tradition. Crucially, he led his troops from a command vehicle equipped with sophisticated communication systems, allowing him to direct his forces in real time. Within just 4 days, despite fierce Polish resistance, Guderian's troops successfully linked up with other forces moving eastward from East Prussia. In less than 10 days, his forces covered approximately 330 kilometers. He achieved victory by capturing Brest-Litovsk, securing his first major military success. After the Polish campaign concluded, Guderian was awarded the Knight's Cross. The German planning for the invasion of France involved Guderian heavily. He participated in the discussions regarding the plan conceived by his War College colleague, General Erich von Manstein. Manstein's audacious approach shifted the main armored attack away from the traditional route through Belgium and the heavily fortified French Maginot Line. Instead, it focused on the central, supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest. Guderian confidently argued that German tanks were fully capable of traversing the rough terrain of the Ardennes. The German High Command entrusted him with leading this high-stakes military gamble. Recognizing the immense responsibility, Guderian successfully lobbied the High Command for more forces. He was granted 7 Panzer divisions, totaling 1,112 tanks, roughly half of all the tanks Germany possessed at that time. Guderian's execution of the plan was masterful. His forces successfully crossed the Ardennes, forded the Meuse River, and decisively won the Battle of Sedan, completely shattering the French defensive lines. His Panzer group then executed the Race to the Sea, a dual movement where the Allies attempted to reach the coast for evacuation to Britain, while German forces pursued them relentlessly to cut off their retreat. This rapid movement culminated in the encirclement of British and French forces at Dunkirk. By June 17, 1940, German forces had bypassed the Maginot Line and neutralized the remaining French forces, signaling France's complete defeat. The operational methodology of the Blitzkrieg doctrine, as implemented by Guderian, was now firmly established. 1. Penetration. Tanks were utilized to pierce the defensive lines at maximum speed. 2. Combined arms, follow-up, motorized infantry, anti-tank artillery, and close air support from the Luftwaffe followed closely behind the initial penetration. 3. Deep exploitation. Once the defenses were breached, the tanks did not wait for the slower infantry, but raced ahead to exploit the gap and paralyze the enemy command structure. This signature, speed, penetration, and deep reach became Guderian's permanent historical mark in military records. The stunning ease of victory in Poland and France convinced Hitler that he could conquer the Soviet Union using the identical swift Blitzkrieg methods. This conviction persisted despite the vast differences in the USSR's sheer size, natural resources, industrial capacity, military manpower, and willingness to endure sustained conflict compared to Western Europe. On June 22, 1941, Guderian commanded Panzer Group II during Operation Barbarossa. He crossed the Bug and Dnieper rivers, and collaborating with Panzer Group III, led by General Hermann Hoff, Guderian achieved a massive encirclement battle near Uman. This operation resulted in the capture of over 300,000 Soviet prisoners. Guderian then advanced toward Smolensk, achieving a victory that destroyed the Soviet 16th, 19th, and 20th Armies. Following this action, he was awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross. Despite these early successes, a severe strategic disagreement emerged within the German High Command. The chief of the German Armed Forces General Staff, Franz Holder, and many German generals, including Guderian, initially opposed Hitler's decision to divert forces south. They sought to convince Hitler to focus the attack directly on Moscow. Guderian was sent to meet Hitler to argue the case for the Moscow offensive. However, upon leaving the meeting, Guderian completely reversed his position. He was no longer convinced of the strategic necessity or viability of conquering the Soviet capital before other objectives. This abrupt change of heart infuriated his direct commander, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, and Holder. Consequently, Guderian began to be treated as an outcast, a pariah, by the respected senior generals of the German army. Following Hitler's dictates, Army Group Center was diverted south toward Ukraine. This maneuver led to the Battle of Kiev, which achieved the largest encirclement operation in military history. The Soviet Southwestern Front was destroyed, leading to the loss of 600,000 Soviet soldiers. However, this victory came at an enormous cost to the German armored capability. Guderian's Panzer Group II lost 80% of its tanks in the intense fighting required for this deep penetration. In mid-September 1941, Guderian finally received the delayed order to attack Moscow. The offensive, which began on September 30th, proved a catastrophic failure. The Blitzkrieg doctrine proved ineffective in the worsening Russian terrain, against increasingly poor weather conditions and facing vastly stiffened Soviet resistance. After assessing the tank battles on the Eastern Front, Guderian immediately proposed a radical solution to German designers. The fastest way to counter Soviet armored superiority was to produce a replicated copy of the excellent Soviet T-34 tank. The failure at Moscow triggered intense mutual accusations among the commanders of Army Group Center. The German generals, perhaps blinded by overconfidence, failed to fully acknowledge that Moscow was an immense capital, incredibly difficult to surround and conquer with the available forces. The bitter internal debates rapidly escalated into outright conflict between Guderian and the general, who replaced Bock as the commander of Army Group Center. As a result of this conflict, Guderian was relieved of command. Source: external detail confirms this occurred in late 1941, early 1942, although the source text cites September 1948 in the same sentence as the event, which is likely a transcription error, but noted based on the source text. While Guderian was marginalized, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recuperating from health issues in Germany, proposed Guderian as his replacement in command of the Afrika Corps. Rommel believed Guderian was the most suitable person for the task. The High Command's response was a brief and unequivocal cable: Guderian is unacceptable. However, following the catastrophic German defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler realized the urgent need to centralize the management of armored forces. Guderian was appointed to the newly created position of Inspector General of Armored Forces. He was the first person to hold this post. His responsibilities included overseeing the entire armored branch, training Panzer forces, and managing tank production in cooperation with Albert Speer, who was then the Minister of Armaments and War Production. This era saw Germany produce its technologically superior third generation of armor, including the famous Panther and Tiger tanks. Source: external. Although these tanks were technically advanced on the battlefield, their limited production numbers meant they failed to restore the German initiative in the war. During his time as Inspector General, Guderian strongly opposed the subsequent major German offensive against Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. He rightly recognized that the Soviets had constructed formidable, deep defensive lines designed to exhaust German forces and permanently cripple their offensive capabilities for the remainder of the conflict. Guderian was later appointed as the acting chief of the High Command General Staff. He served as Hitler's primary military advisor concerning the Eastern Front. He took the position after replacing General Kurt Seitzler, who had resigned, having suffered a nervous breakdown due to his deep frustration with the poor military assessments of the German High Command. Guderian also struggled with the collapsing military situation and Hitler's increasingly irrational command decisions. After the failure of the German counter-offensive to retake the town of Kustrin in Poland, Guderian was finally dismissed from his post on March 28, 1945. He was replaced by General Hans Krebs. On May 10, 1945, Guderian deliberately surrendered to American forces, refusing to surrender to the Soviet forces. He was released in 1948 without trial. The official reason was insufficient evidence against him for committing war crimes. Guderian spent the rest of his life as a prolific author on modern military history. His most famous and influential work is the memoir Panzer Leader. The retired general maintained his outspoken nationalist sentiments even after the conclusion of the war. Heinz Guderian died on May 14, 1954, at the age of 65. The Panzer Division, the physical embodiment of Guderian's tactical theory, was not a fixed, standardized military structure. Instead, it was a dynamic and flexible concept for a combined arms mechanized formation designed for strategic shock and exploitation. The Panzer Division concept centered on a mix of arms to ensure self-sufficiency deep within enemy territory. 1. Tanks, the primary strike and penetration force. 2. Armored and motorized infantry, troops transported in armored vehicles like half-tracks and trucks, essential for securing ground and consolidating the gains achieved by the tanks. 3. Fire support, various artillery units, including anti-tank artillery, often self-propelled. 4. Support units, crucial signaling units, required for rapid command and control, reconnaissance elements, and combat engineers. The size and composition of these divisions varied significantly. For example, the 3rd Panzer Division was the largest in terms of tank count, initially boasting 391 tanks. Conversely, the highly successful 7th Panzer Division, famously commanded by Rommel during the invasion of France, began its life during the invasion of Poland with only 85 tanks. While there was an initial intent to standardize the size and armament of panzer divisions, this goal was quickly abandoned due to the rapid pace of mobilization and re-equipment. By the time of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the average panzer division typically contained between 200 and 250 tanks, in addition to the other supporting armaments. To illustrate the complex combined arms structure Guderian championed, we can examine the organization of the 20th Panzer Division, tank brigades. These were composed of multiple tank regiments. Each regiment contained 3 platoons and a dedicated maintenance platoon. Mechanized infantry. This included a mechanized infantry brigade consisting of 2 regiments. Pioneer Engineer Battalion, a forward combat engineering battalion, was integral to the structure, specifically designed to advance ahead of the main division during operations to clear obstacles and prepare crossings. Support and reconnaissance. Critical support elements included a signal battalion and a reconnaissance battalion, both essential for maintaining the operational tempo required for Blitzkrieg. Artillery. The division included an anti-tank artillery battalion and self-propelled artillery units. Each self-propelled artillery regiment often consisted of 3 artillery batteries. Because Guderian's doctrine required panzer divisions to move at high speed, often operating far ahead of the main army, they had to be built to be logistically self-sufficient for a sustained period. Their structure incorporated specialized logistical service battalions to sustain the high tempo of operations. These comprehensive services included administrative service battalions, which managed vital services such as bakeries and butchers to feed the troops in the field. Furthermore, to maintain control and discipline during rapid and deep movements, the divisions included an enforcement battalion and a military police platoon. This layered complexity ensured that the fighting arm could focus purely on combat penetration and exploitation without being halted by breakdowns in supply or basic subsistence. Heinz Guderian's enduring legacy is rooted in his transformation of the tank from a slow-moving support vehicle into a strategic instrument of shock and decisive action. His genius lay not just in theory, but in the practical, technical, and logistical realization of the Blitzkrieg concept, integrating communication, engineering, and supply into a unified lethal mechanized division. Despite his ultimate failure on the Eastern Front and his conflicts with Hitler and the High Command, the combined arms structure he pioneered remains the definitive blueprint for modern ground combat forces worldwide.